of space journalism. Ashley is an associate editor at Science News. Previously, she worked at The Scientist as a freelance editor and writer, and as a writer at the Simons Foundation, Duke University, and the W.M. Keck Observatory. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and a master's degree in science writing from MIT. Her book, Bright Galaxies, Dark Matter, and Beyond on the Life of Astronomer Vera Rubin, was published by MIT Press in 2021. So welcome to Roger That, Ashley. Take it away.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Excellent. Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you guys today. I'm really excited to be here and give this talk. I'd like to thank Dina Weibel for the invitation and also Grand Valley State University for hosting such a conference. This is such an incredible idea. I'd also want to thank my colleague, Lisa Grossman. She's actually the space reporter at Science News and one of the editors. But she reached out to me and said she couldn't present today, so asked if I could do it in her stead. So here we go. So when I was thinking about this talk, I wanted to start somewhere that I thought maybe would be a place of interest. And obviously, I want to talk about the value of space journalism because I think now that more than ever, it's going to be very important. I didn't realize that, obviously, when I developed the title for the talk. But before we get into the present, I want to go back a little bit. So I chose NASA's Teacher in Space logo from 1984 to open my talk because that's the first space program I heard of as a child. My mom was a teacher. She was a science teacher. And halfway through her career, they opened this program and said, you know, if you're a teacher and you want to go into space, please apply. But at the time, she was pregnant with me, so she couldn't apply. And obviously then Challenger exploded and things kind of changed from there. And so my mom would tell me about the Teacher in Space program from a very early age. And obviously she didn't tell me much about what happened to Challenger, but her message was very clear. Humans could go to space. And so for a kid where the world's already big anyway, that idea just was mind-blowing. Space just seemed incomprehensible, but she would tell us story after story after story about the fact that we could go beyond Earth. And so we grew up hearing about the possibility of life elsewhere. She was a huge Carl Sagan fan. And one of the courses that she developed for her high school students was on the history of science. So I put a couple images here just because these are memories from my childhood of, you know, researching Apollo with her and spending weekends scouring for clips of Walter Cronkite, describing landing on the moon. And we watched October Sky, we watched Apollo 13, we learned about Sputnik, and we talked about the launch of Hubble. And I was probably about 5 at the time, but she felt it was really important to understand what was happening in the current moment in science. And so I credit these stories from my mom as really shaping the genesis of my space journalism career. So fast forward from the 80s and 90s to the early 2000s. This is really when I was getting started as a cub reporter. And I launched headfirst into this. I, as an undergrad, took a bunch of different science classes, but didn't focus on any one in particular because I just couldn't choose. All of the stories were so fascinating. So one of the first stories I remember writing was specifically about supernova and how supernova could populate the universe with all of the elements that we need for life, even everything in you and me. And the story was about the simulations of how that happens, but I just remember being very intrigued by the idea of something beyond us could build the building blocks for who we are. So that's that image on the left. And then the image in the middle, I have a soft spot in my heart for the Mars Phoenix lander, because that was really the first story I ever wrote for Science News. And it was about tasting and touching water on Mars. And so, you know, at first, like when I was first writing about the story, I didn't really understand the significance. But as I was thinking about it more recently, this was a big story. We had put a lander on Mars, and we had detected water ice, and we had touched it, and we had tasted it, right? Like, it wasn't just something we thought was there, it was something that we had shown was there. And I have a quote in the story. I looked it up recently because it was from 2008. And the scientist is basically saying we can now shift our focus from looking and proving that water ice exists on Mars to actually asking questions about, can life exist on Mars with this type of water? So that was, that was happening at the same time. And then another story on the right-hand side, that's the bullet cluster. And I put that image there just as a representation. I actually didn't cover the release of the image, but it's what the image represents, which is kind of a first different look at dark matter, right? The bullet cluster represents dark matter pulling away from regular matter in galaxy collisions. So this relates to some of the work that I did covering Vera Rubin's work and covering kind of the history of dark matter. So that's kind of where we were in the early 2000s, where my head was at. And so the reason I'm sharing these is because they're a foundation for bigger stories to come. And they kind of support my first point about the value of space journalism, which is really like these stories and the ones like them that journalists were covering at the time inspire awe. They make us think bigger than ourselves, which is what my mom always kind of tried to do with her stories. So in that sense, I was following in her footsteps. Okay, so I just wanted to take a step back and think about, well, what is space journalism? And obviously, kind of studying journalism, the principles are to educate, inform, and inspire. And I think with space journalism, what's really fascinating is it makes us ask questions. Again, that broader theme of things that are bigger than just on Earth, just ourselves, just our own humanity. It really makes us ask questions about what else is out there. And it makes us think about the impossible. And then we get to report on when the impossible becomes possible. And I have an example of that, but why does this matter? To me, space journalism matters because we're recording the human experience. Every discovery, every success, every failure, and every start and end to an era is telling our story as we experience it in the universe and helping us try to relate to whatever else is out there. It, again, connects us to something larger than ourselves as humans. And so that's what I find really appealing, and it helps me wake up every day and be excited about work. So I mentioned beginnings and ends. And I think for me, related to kind of how I opened the talk, one of the biggest stories and one of the ends of an era in my career so far has been the end of the space shuttle program. And I think that the space shuttle program had really represented so many things. It was a continuation of humans in space. It was trying to find an economical way to bring people to the space station and have us have a more permanent experience in space. And so I bring up kind of the end of the space shuttle era because I think it gives us a good look at another aspect of journalism, which brings value, which is accountability, right? Holding people to power, looking at issues in spaceflight, in space research, in different challenges that we face. And so I put on a story by Kenneth Chang about the final landing of Atlantis. And Kenneth Chang is one of the most revered space journalists. I think if you're in the journalism world, you definitely go and probably read just about every story he writes because they're very good. They're always well-researched and very thoughtful. And so what I wanted to relay in this particular story that I put up here is not just that Atlantis landed, but he talked about the implications of that. So one of the implications is with the space shuttle era ending, people were going to lose their jobs. They had spent their careers maintaining these shuttles. And so I'm just going to read you a little quote from his story. So he said, hardest hit is United Space Alliance, the company that handled the maintenance of the shuttles and prepared each one for flight. It will lay off 46% of its 5,200 workers in the coming weeks. And I mean, that might not seem like a lot of people, but it helps us think about just how impactful this type of work is. So not only is it awe and wonder that we have the human ingenuity to do this, but it also impacts people. It impacts who has jobs and who doesn't. It impacts potentially how we think or where economics are in certain cities, depending on what's going on with different space programs. So you have the end of that era, but then you also have the start of another era. So on the right, I have kind of the emergence of private spaceflight, right? You have Starship One, which completed the first private spaceflight in 2004. And then you have Dragon X, you have SpaceX Dragon spacecraft simulator, which orbited the Earth. That was in 2010. And so that was like a big milestone because that was getting an unmanned private space capsule into space. And so I've been reflecting on kind of how we handled this as journalists. And we didn't do a lot of reporting, at least at Science News and some of the other places I worked, talking about private spaceflight because we didn't necessarily know how big it would be. I guess NASA had been so ingrained in our culture that we weren't sure if private space flight would play out. Obviously, we're in a different situation now. So we spent a lot of time focused on the end of the shuttle program, but not enough, I think, of thinking about the future of spaceflight. We had stories about some of the little things that were going on, but if I had to do it again, I really would have asked more questions about where we were going with private spaceflight. And I think those are all important. It's even important now, especially if you're trying to hold government agencies and private companies accountable. You have to think about how these two intersect, how jobs are impacted, and even how education factors into human ingenuity, the ability to have enough engineers and scientists to build these programs and dream big and try to get to the next level. So, kind of fast forwarding again, thinking a little bit more about how do we hold power to account now. Obviously, our job as journalists is not to report that everything is wonderful and awe-inspiring, that there are complications, that there are challenges. The public has to be aware of these if we are going to make future choices about what we're going to do in space and who space belongs to. So I think two of the stories that I'll bring up to start to think about, and this is by no means encompassing at all, but the image on the left is one of the last images from the shuttle program. And again, I don't want to kind of take away from what the shuttle program accomplished, but I think we do have to look at some of the drawbacks that came along with it. And I think one of the good things was it did send a diverse set of astronauts to space. More people got to have that experience. But I think if you look at some of the people who've done reporting on the space shuttle program, they'll say it didn't really hit its goals of reducing the cost of space access. And it really failed to get us beyond low Earth orbit to build on the success of Apollo. So those are two issues that we potentially have to grapple back from and come back from as humanity if our goal is to go beyond low Earth orbit. And the other thing, it also cut back on the use of uncrewed probes. So, less rovers, less exploration beyond just the Earth. So that's one type of story where we can start to think about the consequences, report on them, and then think about, okay, what do we want to do going forward as a society and as an entire world involved in this endeavor? Because it really, to me, space exploration does not have national boundaries. It is a thing for everyone, and we all need to be involved. So then on the right-hand side, if we're thinking about everybody being involved in space, let's consider SpaceX Starlink. the goal is seemingly good to provide internet access around the globe. But there are consequences. And again, this goes into who gets to access space, right? And so I'm going to reference a story that my colleague Lisa Grossman reported on about these satellites obviously leaving streaks across the night sky, making images that astronomers take difficult to analyze. And so there are efforts to mitigate this problem. You can modify satellites, you can change their orbits, but those have had mixed results. And so it really begs the question, if you're disrupting astronomers' view of the cosmos, specifically in radio and optical observations, do we really, as a society, have access? I mean, yes, you have your telescopes that are beyond Earth, but we're investing a lot in observations from ground-based telescopes, which is really how a lot of people relate to space. And so we really have to think about the ethics of allowing all of these Starlink satellites up there. Are we eventually going to get to the point where we can't even observe the night sky? I don't have an answer on that, but these are the things that we report on to make people aware of the situations. And then you have to think about the ethical considerations of the satellites themselves. Who gets to access them? That's a whole nother issue that isn't necessarily what we would cover as space reporters. That's more politics, but it involves space because these satellites are now in space. So all of these stories matter. They're all an essential part of how we understand the past and the present and future of space exploration, whether it's robotic, whether it's human, how we are able to really go out and seek more information and use the human ingenuity that we have. So just to reiterate, one of the essential values of space journalism is awe, but also accountability. And I think that is true now more than ever. I mean, our funding agencies and NASA are having severe cuts. And these are things that we are going to be reporting on going into the future and making sure that any effects on how we perceive ourselves in the universe are made clear to the public so that that helps make some decisions about what we do going forward. So I'm going to shift gears and try to go back into a lighter mode. One of the last points that I want to make about covering space is it's in the vein of awe, but it's inspiration in that there's action from how we write things. And so this kind of inspiration, this kind of draw to go and feel like you can be a part of the space community is another thing that I think is important that we convey. I picked a couple different images here to try to represent that. And so one of them is obviously asteroid Bennu, right? We as journalists want to tell people the story that we as humans had the human ingenuity to send a spacecraft to an asteroid and bring a sample back so that we could understand what was on that asteroid. That's no easy feat. I mean, landing anything on something that small, even landing anything on the moon is challenging. And I don't know if you guys remember Rosetta and Philae, but that did not go so well, right? I mean, I talk about that one because that was actually a landing that I was at, and we were so excited to put this lander on a comet. And then you have to report on the disappointment of the fact that it didn't stay on its feet. But that's science. We also have to report that because hopefully somebody will be inspired enough to say, well, what can we learn from that? And how can we try it again and get the lander to stay upright? And then what can we learn? So I mentioned Bennu. I also wanted to mention Voyager, and I know Voyager was talked about earlier in the day, but I wanted to share some writing of another colleague of mine, Andrew Grant, when he reported on Voyager reaching interstellar space. And I just thought some of his wording was so beautiful, again, kind of encapsulating that idea of inspiration. So he wrote, "Humankind has officially extended its reach to the space between the stars." And he talks a little bit about kind of some of the background of that. This was reporting on a paper in Science, of really kind of saying like, we've done it. And so then he has a quote. It said, "This is the beginning of a new era of exploration for us." And that was Ed Stone. And he said, for the first time, we're exploring interstellar space. So just getting across that idea that we have reached something well beyond the comfort zone of our solar system, which is, again, pretty incredible. And it takes a lot of human ingenuity to get there. And then I'm just going to fast forward and read a little bit at the end of the story, because I think he makes a really great point of tying some different key points in space flight together. So it was talking about how Voyager 1 has enough plutonium fuel to keep all of its instruments powered for another 7 years. And again, this was probably in 2012. So anyway, he has a source saying, "All this will give us considerable insight into what's happening in the far reaches of our galaxy." So again, like really emphasizing that point, like we have done something incredible here. And then I really loved Andrew's last line. He said, "For now, Stone and others are excited about the robotic explorer's accomplishments on August 25th, 2012, the same date, coincidentally, that the world lost its most famous human space explorer, Neil Armstrong." So I just thought it was like a really nice way to say, look at what we can do. Look at how all of these things have coincided. If we're putting robots and humans together and really pushing those boundaries, think about what we can achieve. And so I just really liked Andrew's reporting there, because I felt like that story encapsulated this idea of really pushing for inspiration, pushing people to think about, hey, if people can do this, I can do this too. I can be part of building that legacy. And just to get back to the slides, obviously exoplanets, that's another story where things are just super inspirational. If you talk to Sarah Yeager, who's kind of one of the leading edge researchers in this, she's always so motivational, super supportive, talks about how to get more and more people into science. And just the fact that like we're getting closer and closer to finding a planet like Earth. So that's why I put Kepler 1649c. We might not ever find the exact Earth twin, but we're going to find planet after planet that has simple characteristics. Maybe they'll have life, maybe they won't. But like, it's just that search to find something else out there that's similar to us, or that at least piques curiosity about, can there be other life out there? The other image I have is M87. And so imaging, taking an image of the black hole at the center of a galaxy, and same with taking an image at the center of our galaxy. These images, again, show us how our knowledge shifts. And I think they are inspiring in that if you're following the journalism, when I started reporting, there were obviously indirect evidence that these black holes exist. Andrea Ghez had traces of the stars going super fast around the center of the galaxy. And then you fast forward 20 years and we've made an image. Like, it's just, I don't know. I think it's very, very impressive to kind of track that. And again, just see how inspired we can be if we just keep pushing and asking questions. And so I threw Pluto in there just because it's Valentine's Day. And it's got the heart on there. But again, I think having a photograph of this dwarf planet really helped the public be captivated by something so far away, right? Finally, we debated about dwarf planet, where does it exist? What do we think about? But then we see it and it's got this, this anthropomorphic heart where we find it, kind of feel a connection to it. So it's a discovery where you make a connection with something very, very far away, something very far beyond yourself. And I just think, again, to reiterate the 3 points that I want you to take away, the value of space journalism is really in that awe. It's in the accountability, which is a little bit more difficult, but it's also in that inspiration of the next generation, really trying to get people to be inspired and to think that they can somehow contribute to science, whether it's someone like me sharing all of those discoveries, or someone who's an engineer, or someone who wants to be an astronaut, or someone who's willing to volunteer to go and simulate living on Mars. I mean, there's so many ways to get involved. So I'm going to start to wrap up because I know I'm in between you guys and lunch. So the last thought I want to leave you with is just an interesting study I read a couple of years ago. When we think about the value of space journalism, do we think about, we think about the awe, accountability, and inspiration, but can we measure that effect? And people have tried. And so that's why I bring up this study. This was done in 2022, and these researchers were trying to measure that direct effect of, does media change how we support space exploration? Does seeing Walter Cronkite on TV help? Does the tweet about imaging a black hole help? What actually gets us to that idea of, yes, this is important as a human endeavor? And so I'm going to read you just a couple lines from that study and what the researchers found. And it said, so I'll say, the study surveyed the media landscape and looked at how media use predicted support for space exploration. That was kind of their hypothesis. And the results yielded mixed evidence on whether television news viewing predicts support and little evidence that social media use does. But, and this is a big but, the study's findings highlight the potential role of science fiction in shaping public opinion about space exploration, which in turn may influence space policy. And so that's why I've put a bunch of these different science fiction, more recent science fiction stories up there. And I think they too illustrate the values that I communicated about space journalism, right? In all of these different stories, and particularly, I'm thinking of Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary, which is going to come out as a movie, I think, next year. There are run-ins with people in power, right? There are questionable choices made, and the protagonists have to overcome those to push our, discovery forward and to change how we interact with potential aliens that, I'm thinking of three-body problem here, don't necessarily like us in the moment that that we shift gears of the person who's been communicating with them. Or even in Dune, thinking about, can these sandworms live on other planets? What are the right conditions where you might find something like that? Or in Interstellar, thinking about, what does a black hole look like? I mean, if you think about the image that was designed, and I know Kip Thorne was very integral in thinking about that movie, and then you look at how we've imaged a black hole, there's parity there. So maybe, just maybe, while space journalism is important for inspiring the next generation, it could also be important for inspiring science fiction and really using science fiction to help shape the public perception of how we explore the universe. So I'll stop there and just leave you with that question of grappling between journalism and science fiction. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who is here and to the opportunity to talk at this conference. And a happy early birthday to Roger Chaffee. If, I know he's still not alive, but it's his birthday. And I only say that because tomorrow's my birthday too. And so we share a birthday.
Hey, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley. Nice callback to some of our returning viewers will remember Alice Bowman came and spoke about the icy heart of out of Pluto when she talked about Deep Horizons back, I think in the 4th or 5th Roger that, which was again on Valentine's Day. But thank you, Ashley. So we have some questions in the audience. I want to say one of my favorite stories about Opportunity, the rover, was that NASA engineers, when the rover was shutting down, NASA engineers played the Billie Holiday song, "I'll Be Seeing You," which if it turns out that was not right, it will break my heart. So I'm really hoping that was right.
That's true.
But so that's what I wanted to start out with. You sort of, in space journalism, you're trying to communicate the ideas that are that can seem very technical and very densely technical you're trying to communicate it to a wider audience. So how do you decide when you are writing stories like that, what the balance between science and humanity, etc. is? Like, well, how do you decide, how do you grab people without diluting, so you don't want to pander to them, but you also want to sort of get them interested. How is that decision? What do you grapple with when you make that decision?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And the biggest thing is, I think the previous talk talked a little bit about this, communicating at different levels. So I would say in our stories at Science News, we try to hit a range of people. So our leads always try to be kind of fun and snappy. I mean, you heard Andrew's talking about Voyager, like just conveying the idea of like, we have left the solar system, something we built has left the solar system. So we always try to start with something that's relatable. Pluto's heart, the idea of tasting water ice on Mars. It's always something that the person reading it can relate to on a human level. And then we try to build into a bit more of the technicality. So I didn't read some of that to you in Andrew's, but he talks about that idea of leaving the solar system. And then he talks about kind of all of the engineering and luck that went into being able to reach that point. And then we'll try to bring it back again to something that's relatable. So you kind of always have to think about your reader as you're writing this, and just think about like, what would they want to know? What would, I mean, I guess I should say, I can give a little trade tip or trade secret. Oftentimes if we're writing something really technical, I'll talk to my husband or I'll talk to my friends, and I'll just start talking about the story and figure out what do they pick up on. And then that usually helps me write that beginning, that relatable introduction to get into some of the more complex science.
Nice. So this is from Dina. Your job is to share scientific knowledge with the public, but there seem to be people and entities more interested in taking scientific knowledge away from the public. How can you fight those forces, and how can people like those in the audience help?
That's an excellent question. I would say for us right now, one of our biggest and best friends is FOIA. Just continuing to push the government to release more and more information. What we found, and I'm sure some of you have started to see this being reported, is with the internet, you can't completely erase everything. There's always websites that have dated things back. And I'll use the Vera Rubin Observatory, the NSF page as an example. There was a ProPublica story about this. And you can see the changes related to removing any instance of DEI. And what's very sad about that was something that Vera Rubin was very adamant about. She was very adamant about the fact that space is for everyone. Everyone should be able to be involved in doing this type of work. So I think that's another tool that we have at our disposal, is trying to figure out how have things changed. And I think it is about asking questions. Now, I think, you're starting to see more and more newsrooms being pushed out of the White House. That's frightening. But I think we as journalists have to continue to use our principles and our own ingenuity to try to find information. There's always people out there who want to talk, even when it is a threat to their career. So for example, right now we're working on a story about what happens to people who are indirect costs, which is a very inhumane way of speaking about them, if the NIH cuts funding back to 15%. In terms of supporting universities, like how does that work? And that's been a tough story to report. One, because people don't necessarily want to go on the record, and two, you have to track down exactly how those interactions work. And I guess in terms of answering your second question about how people can help, ask questions. I mean, that is always the biggest, most powerful tool you have, is to ask questions, to call your congresspeople, to go to your local newspaper if you see something happening, to go to bigger publications like mine if you see something happening in your own field that you think is important that we report on. I mean, I will say ProPublica, which is one of the best investigative journalism outlets we have right now actually has on their site a tip line where you can put in anonymously things that you see are happening. And if they think it's worthy of following up on, they're going to report on it. So I think it's reaching out to the media you trust, trying to get stories out there, asking questions, and just, again, helping us hold power to account.
Thanks. So another question is, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about space exploration that you see repeated in the media?
Ooh, that's a good one. I mean, I guess the thing that comes to mind, and I guess then it comes down to a definition of media, is, obviously any type of conspiracy theory, right? I've heard a lot of talk recently about the fact that we didn't land on the moon, which breaks my heart, right? It breaks my heart, having worked at the Air and Space Museum with a lot of artifacts, and actually going into some of the private vaults and seeing spacesuits from the Apollo program and seeing the moon dust on them. And anyway, that's a sidetrack. But just kind of the resurgence of some of those conspiracy theories that are very anti-science.
Yeah. Flat Earth.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. We could go on and on.
Right.
You don't necessarily see those in kind of some of your traditional media, but as media becomes more right or more left, you're going to see some of those conspiracy theories pop up. And, really our mission at Science News has shifted to combating misinformation.
Yeah. Actually, while you were talking, when you talked about going to more and more media that you can trust, unfortunately, that list is kind of dwindling for a lot of people. And as you said, there is more sort of media is getting more biased. How does the science journalism, as a science journalism, do you sort of try to stay above that? You try to sort of report on the science because, it should be apolitical, it should be unbiased, it should be completely. How do you balance that? How do you balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we really work hard to do is try to get outside comment. And you run into this even if you're trying to get outside comment from people that are cited in papers, right? You'll reach out to someone, it's competing groups, so they're going to say something negative. So some of it is just really kind of, you have to, instead of reaching out to 3 people now, you have to reach out to 6 people and really make sure that you're trying to find the best representation of whatever science topic you're talking about. You're really trying to figure out where are scientists in this moment on this question, not necessarily getting into the politics of left or right. And it's getting harder and harder, but I do think there are scientists out there who haven't necessarily been pulled in those directions and who do care about putting accurate information out there.
So this is from our audience. If you could interview anyone in the space industry, past or present, who would it be and why?
Oh, that is a good question. Anybody in the space industry? Past or present? Oh, I think. I'm really trying to rack my brain.
Are you trying to narrow it down to one person? Because you can give a couple.
Yeah, I was going to say your top 3.
Top 3, top 100.
I don't know. Part of me would want to go back in time and think about space during World War II, because you had a lot of technology being developed that ultimately really opened up our view of the cosmos. If you think about radio telescopes, that technology was developed during World War II, not to look up, but to transmit signals during the war. And I also would be interested in women's role in science during World War II. There's an instance where There's a woman who was able to work at one of the big telescopes in California because she knew how to operate it, and all the men were drafted and fighting. But then when they all came back, she got shut out of being able to use the telescope. So I think there's a lot of early history there that would be interesting. I think today it would be interesting to talk about the shift from NASA to private spaceflight and get a really good understanding of whether or not space is going to be inclusive going forward, or whether it's going to be reserved for the billionaires, and ask questions about how we best work to preserve it as something for everyone.
And then what, in your view, moving forward, is sort of the value of space journalism in shaping space policy, and not just local, not just in the US, but maybe globally? What do you think is happening? Are there some countries getting it right? Are there some countries doing kind of interesting work around space policy that is something that you can report on in when you cover space journalism?
Yeah, I think there is value in that. I'm thinking of kind of the successes India has had sending landers to the moon. You can see the nationalism there and the support for really trying to get behind those missions. And I think that is something that's lacking in the US right now. I mean, if you think about the Apollo era, everybody was on board, right? And yes, it was a competition with Russia or the USSR, but everybody was on board. We were all behind that. There was energy from Kennedy about, we are going to land a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And, sure enough, we did it. So I think you have to look at to the places where people are working as a cohesive unit. And maybe we have to think about places where we can all work together if we are going to start to move into this private sector, where the collaborations are around the globe. I mean, the International Space Station is a great example of what can happen when different countries work together, right? You don't necessarily see those space politics up there. If an astronaut's life is on the line, it's not going to be like, well, I'm not going to open the door for you because you're from, the US and I'm from Russia or China. Like, no, they're going to all work together because humanity comes before boundaries, before national boundaries. So I think that's another place to look. I really do think there's value in us trying to all work together, again, to create space for everyone, not just a subset of people. But it's just we all do better when we work together as a human entity.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You weren't paid for using our tagline, but that was wonderful.
Oh,
There's enough space for everyone is the tagline for Roger that. But do you know of a science journalist ever taking a private space flight? The questioner says, all I can think of is Michael Strahan, and he's not a science journalist at all. Do you think the firsthand experience of it would be beneficial? And would you go yourself if you were given the opportunity?
Ooh, I think the thing we'd have to be concerned of is conflict of interest. If those seats are not inexpensive, and I would want to know what am I responsible to do in return for you for putting me on that flight, right? So I think as straight up journalists, there's a lot of conflict of interest questions there. I think you do have people getting into social media and people who want to get into spaceflight and some of these private entities sharing their stories. There's a couple female astronomers that I'm thinking of, or astronauts that I'm thinking about, who do a lot on social media, who have actually recorded being on the rocket, going up, floating in space, doing some of their research. Their names are escaping me at the moment. But these are people who might not necessarily be traditional media, but kind of in that broader definition of media. And I think their experiences are important too, right? It does show that space can be for everybody. It does give us another view of what it's like to be on a private space flight and to go to space. But I don't know that you would get a traditional media journalist on one of those flights. It would be a very complicated contract.
And then recently, the stuff that I've been reading about it has focused on Sunitha Williams and the two astronauts who are quote unquote has been reported in the media stranded, which is not necessarily, would you say? I mean, is that one that the mainstream media is getting the
Yeah.
toward? Could you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think this has come up and actually been exacerbated by certain people who are involved in government right now, because they've used the word stuck. But there's been a plan since last summer to bring these two astronauts home, right? There has been a plan in place. The technology is available. Yes, there are issues with Blue Origin, which why they can't bring it back, and Boeing, but SpaceX can do it. And it's just been coordinating and trying to make sure that we do it safely and have all the checks and balances in place. So I think it has gotten skewed in certain media circles. Again, trying to like drum up that drama of well, we don't, space is scary and we don't know what we're doing and these people are stuck. But I don't necessarily know that that's a correct representation. I mean, Lisa Grossman, our reporter, when she was very careful in reporting the story, just to be clear that there is a plan. We have the technology to do this. Their lives were never in danger. There's research that they can do while they're up there. They have a purpose. So again, I think that's where we get into media and that edge of trying to relate to people, but then kind of being overly dramatic to put eyeballs on pages, because journalism is also a business. So you have to walk that fine line.
So what would your advice now be to a young space journalist, or if you could give yourself advice, what would that be? What would like some of the take homes be?
Number one, read as much as you can. Try to get a sense of what is happening, whether it's private, whether it's public. Journalism rule number, I don't know, probably 5, follow the money. Like, where is funding coming from? Just so you have a context of what's happening and really thinking about, is this a story about awe and inspiration, or is this an accountability story? And how do I tell those in a different way? 2, ask a lot of questions and don't be afraid to ask the dumb question, right? There's always going to be somebody who wants to explain it to you. There's going to be somebody who wants to teach you because they're excited about whatever their finding is, or however their, engineering device works, or whatever it is. And 3, don't be afraid to just get started writing. I mean, if I went back and looked at my early stories compared to now, oh my gosh, I'd probably be very disappointed in myself. But if you really want to do this and you really want to share stories, you have to start somewhere. You have to get words on a page and get publications, and your editors are there to help you make the story it's the best that it can be. So it's really, you kind of have to just go have courage and start.
Yeah. And then the way younger people, and well, not just younger people, me too, let's be honest, I doom scroll TikTok, so the way we consume our information is changing. So how do space journalists kind of morph with that? Do you have a TikTok, channel that you would use? Because how do we go from that long form deep dive into a story to sort of putting it in terms that's more palatable to how we consume information now?
Yeah, I think you've got some really good TikTokers out there. We have a TikTok channel. We're still building, thinking as a legacy publication, how do we shift to this medium and use it appropriately? But you've got some really good TikTokers out there. I took a class with one, and they want to put as much information as they can in 30 seconds. So we watched a couple examples, and it was like, count how many facts people can squeeze into this. And if you watched, it was like 10 to 15 facts in the TikTok about how this works. So it's kind of thinking about how, instead of writing it, how you would talk about it. And you might only have 30 seconds in an elevator. What is the point you need to get across? Right now, we've got to do the elevator pitch for science.
Yeah.
Or for space, or whatever topic you have. So it's really thinking about how can I put as much information in 30 seconds as possible. And you might lose some of the nuance and some of the detail, but then hopefully at least that TikTok is the starting point of, a person maybe doing more research, hopefully.
Right.
I can't guarantee it.
No, but it's true because there's so many different ways of communicating this. And actually, one of the next questions is from Deborah says, how would you say artists and illustrators can best assist space journalism and just space advancement at this time? As someone who wants to go into scientific illustration, has a passion for space, I'm not sure how to best work towards that in this current climate.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think those stories are definitely going to be in your awe and inspiration stories, your discoveries about what else is out there. I mean, I think of exoplanets as the biggest one because it's really hard to image them. So someone has to sketch them. And so that's a really good place to work because you can work with the scientists. We understand atmospheres. We understand probably a little bit about what an exoplanet is made of. So that factors into it. So I think, the other one, the work by Kip Thorne and the team with Interstellar, that's another perfectly good example. What is it that we don't have the capacity to image yet in space? And how do we use the latest data to translate words into images? Like, what can we use from that data to illustrate these really elaborate physical concepts?
Well, thank you so much, Ashley. It's 11:51. It's our time. This was wonderful. You get all the snaps. And happy birthday for you for tomorrow.
Yeah.
You and Roger.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dina, what's coming up?
Happy birthday. Coming up at 12:30, we've got Andy Calloway, who's going to tell us about the OSIRIS-REx mission. He's from the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab.
Woohoo! We also have a short break for lunch for everyone, so we will resume at 12:30. Thank you all for sticking with us, and we've had three wonderful talks. I think this is off to a great start.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Ashley. I feel like you might get an email from me. That's all I'm saying.
Oh yeah, I would like the TikTokers' names.
Yeah. See everybody soon.